Okay, so just in a nutshell, I think this is what you probably already know, that George Norcross's people controlled the Assembly and the Senate. He controls their campaigns. He funds their campaigns. They don't always all get along, but when it comes down to a vote, they'll all be together. And this is actually a word spoken by this gentleman, Joey DiVincenzo, who is the Essex County executive, who, in conjunction with George Norcross, basically runs the state. And this is him explaining in 2014 why he's jealous of George, because George has seven senators and 12 assembly people. I think the numbers have shifted a little bit. And Joey DiVincenzo only controls 2 senators, or controlled at that time, and 5 assembly people. And in Norcross's own words, this is him speaking, "We have a unified political organization that knows that in order to serve South Jersey, you must function in that manner. There are many times when we have strong differences of opinion on things, but we settle inside of a room and we always come out unified." So how did we get here? Because it wasn't always like this. And if you talk to legislators, they'll say it's never been quite this bad. Well, according to Norcross and Joey DiVincenzo, it began in 2009, right after Christie was elected governor. They sat down and basically worked out an arrangement where the South would have the Senate and the North would have the Assembly. And so Steve Sweeney, Norcross's childhood friend, became the Senate president, which he still is, and Sheila Oliver became the Assembly Speaker. She was previously an Assemblywoman from East Orange, and of course now she's Lieutenant Governor. And in DiVincenzo's own words, I called George, and that's how we put it all together. We got 2 votes for him, for Senator Sweeney, and he delivered our votes with the Assembly people, and we were able to get the majority, and Oliver became the Speaker. It was very, very convenient. So it worked out very well during the Christie administration. They had a very good working relationship. This is still from Ryan Liz's article. Norcross enjoyed benefit after benefit during the Christie administration, playing a crucial role in every legislative victory the Christie had, while seeing his own priorities signed into law by the governor. So there's a long list of things that were signed into law under Christie that benefited Mr. Norcross. He restructured the state's higher education institutions. Obviously, Rowan University benefited tremendously. The emergency medical services went to Cooper Hospital, whose board he chairs. I'm guessing you guys know a bit of this already, right? I'll get to some newer stuff. And this is, I think, a particularly interesting one, which is this, oh, I love this little laser thing. Okay, so the New Jersey's corporate incentive programs were overhauled with a heavy emphasis on benefiting South Jersey and Camden in particular, and miraculously 86 million of those tax credits went to George Norcross's own insurance firm. Just an accident. And George is very adroit at using the system. So sometimes it doesn't work out in a particular political coalition, and he manages to move along and find new partners. For example, he also doesn't bode anyone who resists very well. So, for example, although Sheila Oliver was the Speaker, she didn't always toe the line. And when she started to disagree too much, he switched out. He made a deal with different political bosses in the North. And when Vinnie Prieto became the Speaker. And then when Vinnie started to talk back too much and not to do what he was told, they switched out once more. But it was a little more complicated because in 2016, the plan was that Steve Sweeney was going to become governor, and then they would control the governorship and the Assembly and the Senate. But that's not exactly how it worked out. When Jersey City Mayor Fulop dropped out of the race, all the northern county bosses got together, and they did not want Norcross to have that kind of power. So they jumped from Fulop to supporting Phil Murphy, and Sweeney was forced out of the race because he didn't have their support. He didn't have the line, which Sue's going to talk about in a little while. Fortunately, Norcross had Plan B, which is he made a deal with the Middlesex machine and municipal political organization, and Middlesex Assemblyman Craig Coughlin became the Assembly Speaker in exchange for votes from the Middlesex delegation for keeping Senator Sweeney in the Senate presidency. Right? So that's how we got to this. So what does it mean to control the legislature? It means quite a bit. So the Senate president and the Assembly Speaker have complete control over who serves on the committees, over who chairs and vice chairs the various legislative committees, and that brings many perks to those individuals. If you're the chair or the vice chair, you get money for staff. You also get to decide what legislation moves or gets heard in your committee, And you tend to generate more campaign contributions when you're a chair or a vice chair because there are people who want to get their business in front of your committee. The Speaker and the Senate President get to decide what legislation ultimately gets voted out of committee, even though the chair has a lot of influence. And most importantly, they get to decide what legislation gets voted on by the full Assembly and the full Senate. So basically, they control the entire legislative agenda. And you're seeing that play out now with Governor Murphy, obviously, and their unwillingness to work with him on a lot of issues. So if you look at the leadership on the just New Jersey State website, on the legislative website, you'll see that this is the Senate leadership, that there's a recurrence of certain counties. That's not to say that every one of these individuals is a bad person or in any way always going to vote the line, but there is a preponderance of those three delegations, Middlesex, South Jersey, and Essex, that tends to show up. So this is the Senate, and every person on here is a loyal soldier, even if they're not from one of those counties. You'll notice that they tend to vote with the leadership. Same thing in the Assembly, a lot of Middlesex, a lot of South Jersey, a little bit of Essex. Again, many of these are really wonderful legislators. Just because they're part of, say, the Middlesex delegation doesn't mean that they're in any way dishonest or bad people, and many of them are quite progressive. It's just that because they're in Middlesex, they'll get elevated and get better placement. Sometimes it's incredibly blatant. So this is Senator Teresa Ruiz, who is the senator from the 29th District, and she is also, you can't really read it from there, but she's also the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Essex County Executive. That would be that Joey DiVincenzo that we started with. And she is the Senate President Pro Temp. She is the chair of the Senate Education Committee, which is a very powerful position. And she is on the Budget Committee. This is Assemblywoman Ileana Pinter-Marin, who is also from the 29th District. And look, she also works for Joey DiVincenzo in her day job. And she chairs the Joint Budget Oversight Committee and co-chairs the New Jersey Legislative Select Oversight and Appropriations Committees, very powerful committees. So it's not subtle. Like, they work for one political boss and then they benefit from it in the legislature. The leadership has tremendous power not only to appoint the committees, they also have tremendous power to reward and punish legislators. I hope I'm not giving you PTSD here. Been there, done that. I know. And lived, thankfully. So a couple of examples. Senator Nia Gill, who tends to be quite independent, and she used to be considered part, I think, of Joey DiVincenzo's delegation, but she tends to do what she thinks is right for her folks in the 34th District, which is Montclair. And as a result, she lost the chairmanship of the Commerce Committee after 10 years. She was replaced as the Senate Pro Temp by Teresa Ruiz, who we just saw a minute ago. And most recently, just 2 months ago, she was removed by Sweeney from both the Judiciary and the Budget Committee. She was actually the vice chair of Judiciary, and she was removed entirely from both committees. So she was just sent off to Siberia, in effect, for not doing what she was told. Another example, not quite as extreme. So Brian Stack, who often has aligned himself with the machine, he happened to disagree on the legislative gerrymandering, which I know you'll hear about some more later today. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it already. So he was taken off of Budget and Judiciary. So that was enough of a transgression to lose those two very powerful positions. So how do they use their power, right? One way that they use their power is basically to distort the legislative process. And the Camden folks, this might look a little familiar. So this is from 2014. This is the Urban Hope legislation when it was being amended. Urban Hope is the legislation that affects only Camden that created the Renaissance charter schools. And the initial legislation was not quite the way that it was being implemented on the ground. And so the way that that was remedied was legislation retroactively to fix what they were doing, which was kind of illegal. But the way the legislation happened was a week before the legislative session was over, at 11 o'clock at night, they dropped this bill in the Senate and Assembly Budget Committee, and nobody had seen the bill. And in fact, there was an article that quoted one of the Republican senators who said, we didn't have the bills in advance, so they were being asked to vote on right then. I didn't know what the hell the bills were. So this is not atypical. It came out of the committees. Of course, those committees are stacked with allies, so everything comes through the committees. And it was passed by the full Senate and Assembly right after. This is just one of many, many, many examples. It was just a particularly egregious one that got covered by the press. So this distortion of the legislative process is one of the ways that they use their power. Another way they use their power is by controlling powerful committees and boards. You may already be aware of this fact that Governor Murphy can't get his nominees through. And those include judicial nominees, includes various authorities and boards. The State Board of Education, a very powerful body that decides a lot of policies related to our schools. Right before the governor took over, Senator Sweeney worked with Governor Christie to stack all those committees, all the judiciary openings, all the boards, and he put 5 or 6 new people on the State Board of Education who align with Governor Christie's idea about education but do not align with Governor Murphy, and now Murphy cannot replace them because they won't move his nominations. So controlling this board is a very powerful role. Generating resources for themselves and their allies. I'm guessing you're probably familiar with the Economic Opportunity Act. We talked about it a little bit earlier in terms of the tax credits. So in 2013, the legislature passed the Economic Opportunity Act, which greatly expanded New Jersey's tax break program for businesses, particularly a lot of sweeteners in parentheses for Camden. In 2014, the Economic Development Authority approved a $260 million tax break, one of the largest ever, for Holtec International, which just happens to be a company that is owned by a friend of George Norcross, and Norcross sits on their board. A coincidence. And as I mentioned earlier, another one of these tax credits went to George Norcross's firm, $86 million, to allow them to move to Camden from a town nearby. In January, the controller released a report on this particular tax credit program, which, by the way, $11 billion has been approved for tax credits so far. And what they found was that the Economic Development Authority had not properly determined whether businesses had, in fact, created or retained jobs, which was ostensibly the reason for the program. And they did not evaluate whether programs generated any economic benefits for the state. So that's a lot of money with really unknown impact. Now, we could have a whole discussion about whether even when it ostensibly does generate jobs, $80,000 per job is a good investment, but that's another conversation. As Sheila Reinterson of the New Jersey Policy Perspectives put it, every New Jersey taxpayer should be furious that the state has handed out billions of dollars in corporate tax breaks with no strings attached when our schools are underfunded, our roads are falling apart. There's a lot of other needs in the state. Just want to give you one more example. You might be familiar with this one as well, with PSE&G. So 4 months after securing a $300 million annual subsidy to support its nuclear operations, PSE&G gave a $55,000 donation to a super PAC called General Majority, which is affiliated with George Norcross. And surprisingly, General Majority spent heavily to support the re-election campaign of Senate President Steve Sweeney, who just happened to be the primary sponsor of the legislation that benefited PSE&G. Another coincidence. And last but not least, they use their power to do special favors for allies. So you may know former Camden Mayor, I'm sorry, I'm giving you guys PTSD, I know. Former Camden Mayor Dana Red, who spent most of her career at about $100,000 paying into a pension system. When she became mayor of Camden, she had to drop out of that system. So Senator Sweeney passed legislation basically specifically for her to get her back into the pension system. And then coincidentally, she got a $275,000 a year job on an obscure board that did not do a job search, that just specifically hired her, which set her up for a 6-figure pension that was substantially more than she ever made, let alone what she paid into the pension system. What's that? There you go. And as Matt Friedman of Politico, who's an excellent journalist, if you're not reading him already, you should be, pointed out, this was all happening as Sweeney has been touring the state, talking about the second round of pension and health care reforms that he wants to inflict on public sector employees. So as Friedman pointed out, it's an outlandish example of our state's political machines using the system for their friends while ensuring that the little people must sacrifice, insisting that the little people must sacrifice. So the other example I just want to share with you is one you're also probably going to be familiar with. Oh, that print is really small for some reason. So Don Norcross, Congressman Don Norcross, before he became a congressman, was elected to this assembly in 2009. A week after he became an assembly member, Senator Dana Red, these names are consistent, right? You're hearing the same names over and over, was elected mayor of Camden. So she stepped down from the Senate, became mayor of Camden, and South Jersey Democratic County Committee members unanimously selected Donna Norcross to fill her seat in the state Senate. As an incumbent, he won a special election in 2010 and then was reelected in 2011. And then in 2013, Congressman Rob Andrews stepped down. And on the same day that he stepped down, this is amazingly impressive coordination, virtually every major New Jersey Democratic power player endorsed Norcross for Congress, and he became a congressman. So just to sum it up, what enables the machines to maintain this level of power? Well, a whole bunch of stuff, and you're going to hear more details, so I'm not going to go into the ballot line or the county committee structure, because I'm guessing that these guys are going to talk about that a little bit. But you have leadership PACs, which are able to finance candidates and give them a huge competitive advantage. You have largely non-competitive legislative districts in the state, so as long as you get the line and you're the candidate for the Democratic Party, you're probably going to win. You have no initiative and referendum process. Initiative and referendum has its limitations, but basically what it means is the legislature controls everything. There's no end run around them. You can't do a petition and get a certain percentage of the population to sign it, like, say, in California, and get something on the ballot. We're stuck. This is what we have to work with. There are interlocking political positions. The example I gave you earlier about Senator Ruiz, you can be Joey DiVincenzo's staff member and be in the legislature. You have no statewide public advocate or any role that basically cuts across whose responsibility it is to look out for the people of the state. Right? The governor, presumably, right? But there's nobody outside of that structure. And we have very good media, but we don't have a centralized media because we have two major markets, and so people don't read the same thing, and there's no really dominant newspaper. So a lot of this, everything I presented is basically quotes from really good journalists' stories, but nobody's reading across the board these various venues. And I am being told to stop, but I'm also done, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.